The avoidant person is experiencing something they never anticipated, never prepared for, never believed was possible, given their assumptions about the dynamic and their expectations about your behavior based on your past patterns of patience and pursuit. They're experiencing genuine withdrawal, psychological and emotional withdrawal symptoms from your absence, from the loss of your presence in their life, from being cut off from the supply and the support and the connection you provided that they took for granted, while assuming it would always be available, no matter how they treated you or how many times they pushed you away or how inconsistently they showed up. The withdrawal is hitting them hard because they operated throughout the relationship under the fundamental assumption that you would always return, that no matter how many times they withdrew or created distance or went cold or disappeared, you would be there when they decided they wanted connection again. That your patience was infinite and your availability was guaranteed, and your willingness to try again was a permanent condition they could rely on regardless of their behavior. This assumption that you'd return, that you'd always be available, that the cycle of their withdrawal followed by your acceptance and your welcoming them back was a perpetual pattern that would continue indefinitely, is what allowed them to employ their patterns without fear of permanent consequences. What made them feel safe pushing you away because they believed they could always pull you back when they wanted? What gave them a sense of control and security that they could have distance when they needed it and connection when they desired it? Because you were a constant, reliable presence who would wait and would welcome them back. But now they're discovering this assumption was catastrophically wrong, that you're not returning, that your withdrawal is permanent rather than a temporary boundary that would soften with time, that the door they assumed would always be open has closed definitively, and they cannot get back through it, no matter what they try or what they feel or how desperately they want to undo the pattern that finally drove you away for good. The withdrawal symptoms they're experiencing are not metaphorical. They're experiencing actual psychological and physiological symptoms similar to addiction withdrawal. Because you were a source of supply they were dependent on without recognizing their dependence. Because your presence provided emotional regulation and meaning and validation they didn't acknowledge needing. Because the pattern of push-pull that characterized the relationship created intermittent reinforcement that's literally addictive. And now that the source of this supply is permanently cut off rather than temporarily distant, they're experiencing the crash that comes from losing access to what they were psychologically dependent on while believing they were independent and self-sufficient. Why they assumed your return was guaranteed, no matter what they did. The avoidant person operated under specific assumptions about your reliability and your availability that made them believe your return was guaranteed regardless of their behavior. Understanding why they believed you'd always come back reveals the psychological framework that made permanent loss unimaginable to them. They assumed your return was guaranteed because you had always returned before, establishing a pattern they extrapolated would continue indefinitely. Every previous time the avoidant withdrew or created distance or pushed you away, you came back. You gave them another chance. You accepted them back when they were ready for connection again. You demonstrated through repeated behavior that their withdrawal didn't create permanent loss, but created temporary distance that you would close when they signaled they were ready. This pattern repeated multiple times. They pushed away. You gave space but remained available. They returned. You welcomed them back. Each repetition reinforced their belief that this pattern was permanent, that your return was a reliable outcome they could count on, that no matter how many cycles occurred, you would always be there to restart the connection when they wanted it. They extrapolated from past pattern to future certainty without recognizing that patterns can break, that patience has limits, that repeated cycles eventually exhaust even the most understanding person. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they interpreted your patience and understanding as an inability to leave rather than as a choice to stay. The avoidant observed your extraordinary patience with their patterns, your consistent efforts to understand them, your willingness to give chances and to work through difficulties, but they misinterpreted the source of these qualities. They didn't see your patience as strength or your understanding as choice. They saw these as evidence that you couldn't leave, that you needed them too much to walk away, that you were dependent on the relationship in ways that meant you'd tolerate any behavior rather than lose access to them. This misinterpretation made your return seem guaranteed because they believed you were incapable of the strength required to leave permanently. They believed your attachment to them was strong enough to override any mistreatment. They believed you needed them more than you needed to respect yourself or to protect yourself from their patterns. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they believed their value to you was greater than their patterns' cost to you. The avoidant maintained a belief about the balance of the relationship. Their positive qualities, their value as a partner, what they offered you, outweighed the cost of their patterns. They believed that yes, they had difficult patterns, but they were still valuable enough, still special enough, still important enough to you that you'd continue accepting the patterns to maintain access to their positive qualities. This belief about the balance sheet made your return seem inevitable. Why would you permanently leave someone whose value exceeded their costs? They couldn't imagine that the balance had shifted, that their patterns' costs had grown to exceed their value, that you'd reached a point where what you were losing through their patterns outweighed what you were gaining through their presence. They assumed your return was guaranteed because your investment in the relationship signaled a commitment they believed was irrevocable. The avoidant observed your significant investment, your time, your emotional energy, your efforts to understand and accommodate them, your vulnerability, your consistent presence despite their inconsistency. They interpreted this investment as a sunk cost that would keep you committed because people typically don't abandon investments they've put significant resources into. They believed your investment created a commitment that would make permanent leaving psychologically difficult for you because leaving would mean accepting that all the effort and energy and time you'd invested hadn't resulted in the relationship you were working toward. This belief about your investment creating binding commitment made them assume you'd continue trying, continue returning, continue investing, rather than accepting the investment as a loss and walking away. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they could see you still cared about them despite their patterns causing you pain. The avoidant wasn't completely blind. They could perceive that you cared about them, that your feelings were genuine, that you had an emotional attachment that their patterns hadn't destroyed, but they made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that because you cared, you would always return, that caring was sufficient to ensure your continued availability regardless of their behavior. They didn't understand that people can care deeply about someone while still choosing to leave, that love doesn't eliminate boundaries, that caring about someone doesn't create an obligation to tolerate harmful patterns indefinitely. They conflated your caring with your availability, believing the former guaranteed the latter, not recognizing that caring can exist alongside a firm decision to protect yourself by leaving. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they believed time would make you forget or minimize how their patterns hurt you. The avoidant thought that even if you were hurt enough to create distance temporarily, time would heal the hurt, would make you forget the specific pains their patterns caused, would minimize in your memory how difficult the relationship was. They believed that with enough time, you'd remember the good parts and forget the bad parts, would miss them enough that the missing would override the memory of being hurt, would be willing to try again because time had softened your resolve and had made the relationship seem better in retrospect than it felt in the present. This belief about time's healing and minimizing effects made them assume that even if you withdrew temporarily, eventually time would bring you back. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they maintained an unconscious belief that they controlled the relationship's trajectory and could determine when it continued or ended. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant had been the one controlling distance. They decided when to withdraw, when to return, when connection happened, when distance was created. This pattern of control gave them a sense that they were the determiner of the relationship's trajectory, that they had the power to shape when things continued and when things paused. This sense of control created an unconscious assumption that ending would also be their choice, that if the relationship ended permanently, it would be because they decided to end it, not because you decided to leave permanently. They couldn't imagine that you would take control of the trajectory, that you would be the one to decide the relationship was over, that you would remove yourself permanently when they hadn't chosen for things to end permanently. They assumed your return was guaranteed because they projected their own attachment onto you, believing that if they couldn't easily move on, then surely you couldn't either. The avoidant, despite their patterns and their defenses, was attached to you. They cared more than their behavior suggested. They were more invested than their withdrawal patterns implied. They would struggle more without you than they anticipated. They projected this attachment onto you, assuming that if they were this attached, then you must be even more attached, given that you were more openly invested. This projection made your permanent leaving seem impossible. If they couldn't easily move on and they were the defended one, how could you move on when you were the more openly attached one? This logic seemed sound, but was based on the false premise that attachment level determined capacity to leave, not recognizing that you could be deeply attached while still choosing to leave because your self-respect and your need for reciprocity exceeded your attachment. The devastating reality check when your withdrawal proved permanent. The avoidant person experienced a devastating confrontation with reality when they discovered that their assumption about your guaranteed return was false, that your withdrawal was a permanent decision rather than a temporary boundary. Understanding the specific elements of this reality check reveals how completely their expectations were violated and how devastating the recognition of permanent loss has been. The reality check came when they reached out expecting your response and received only silence that communicated a finality they hadn't anticipated. The avoidant, operating under the assumption you'd return eventually, reached out, sent a message, made attempted contact, extended communication they expected would be received and would open the door to reconnection. But instead of the response they expected, they received silence. Not an angry response, not a hurt response, not even a conflicted response, just complete silence that communicated something they hadn't prepared for. You were done. You weren't engaging. You weren't available for the reconnection they assumed they could initiate whenever they were ready. This silence was a devastating reality check because it proved their assumption wrong, proved you weren't waiting to return, proved their reach out didn't have the power to restore the connection they believed it would have. The reality check came when they observed through social media or mutual friends that you were moving forward with your life in ways that proved you weren't focused on them or waiting for them. The avoidant expected that even if you withdrew temporarily, you'd be stuck on them, would be struggling without them, would be organizing your life around missing them and hoping for reconciliation. But what they observed was different. You were moving forward, building a new life, engaging with activities and people, appearing happy, or at a minimum, appearing engaged with your life in ways that proved you weren't stuck on them. This observation provided devastating evidence that your withdrawal wasn't a temporary boundary while you waited for them to come back, but was a permanent redirection of your energy and attention away from them and toward your own life. The reality that you were moving on while they were stuck on you inverted their expectations and proved permanent loss in ways their denial couldn't dismiss. The reality check came when time passed without any softening of your boundaries or any indication you were reconsidering your position. The avoidant expected that with time, your resolve would soften, your boundaries would weaken. Your decision to withdraw permanently would prove to be a temporary emotional response rather than a permanent choice. They waited for this softening, anticipated that days or weeks or months would make you miss them enough to reconsider. They believed time was on their side, but time passed and no softening occurred. Your boundaries remained firm. Your position remained unchanged. Your withdrawal remained complete. This persistent lack of change over time provided a reality check that your decision was a permanent choice rather than a temporary emotional reaction, that time wasn't healing what they thought would heal, that their assumption about time bringing you back was false. The reality check came when they attempted different approaches to break through your withdrawal and discovered that nothing worked to restore your availability. The avoidant tried different strategies: direct reach outs, indirect communication through mutual friends, appearing in places you might see them, posting things on social media designed to get your attention. They expected one of these approaches would work, would crack your resolve, would restore some level of engagement, but nothing worked. Every approach was met with maintained boundaries, with continued silence, with a firm refusal to engage. This failure of multiple approaches provided a devastating reality check that your withdrawal wasn't about the specific way they were reaching out, but was about a fundamental decision you'd made that no approach would overcome, that you'd close the door in ways that their attempts to reopen it couldn't affect. The reality check came when they recognized their own suffering from your absence exceeded any suffering they'd anticipated and proved their dependence on you they'd denied. The avoidant expected that if you withdrew permanently, they'd be fine, maybe miss you somewhat, maybe be temporarily sad, but fundamentally be fine because they didn't need you the way they believed you needed them. But the actual experience of your permanent absence proved this expectation catastrophically wrong. They weren't fine. They were suffering intensely. They missed you desperately. They were experiencing withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, depression, obsessive thinking, inability to enjoy anything, constant awareness of your absence. This intensity of suffering provided a reality check about their own attachment and dependence. They needed you far more than they believed, were far more dependent on what you provided than they'd acknowledged, were suffering from withdrawal in ways that proved you were essential rather than optional to their well-being. The reality check came when they compared their assumption about the power dynamic to the reality of the power dynamic your withdrawal revealed. The avoidant assumed a power dynamic where they had more power. They controlled distance. They determined when connection happened. They were less attached and therefore less vulnerable. They were the prize you were trying to win, but your permanent withdrawal revealed a completely different power dynamic. You had the ultimate power all along, the power to leave, the power to enforce permanent boundaries, the power to choose yourself over them, the power to remove yourself completely from the dynamic in ways they couldn't prevent or undo. This revelation that the power dynamic was inverted from what they believed provided a devastating reality check about who actually had control and who was actually more vulnerable to loss. The reality check came when they attempted to date others and discovered that comparing everyone to you made moving on impossible in ways they didn't experience moving on from previous partners. The avoidant expected that if you were permanently gone, they'd move on relatively easily as they'd done after previous relationships. But attempting to move on proved impossible because everyone was compared to you and found lacking. No one understood them like you did. No one had your patience or your specific qualities. No one created what you created. These constant unfavorable comparisons provided a reality check that you weren't just another partner they could move on from, but were special and potentially irreplaceable in ways that made permanent loss far more devastating than they'd anticipated, made moving on far more difficult than they had experienced with previous losses. The reality check came when their defensive narratives that justified the loss failed to provide the comfort or the protection they usually provided after relationship endings. The avoidant typically protects themselves after relationships end through defensive narratives. It wasn't the right fit. They're better off. The person had flaws that justified the ending. But these narratives didn't work with your loss. The narratives felt hollow, felt like obvious lies they were telling themselves, failed to provide the psychological comfort they usually provided. This failure of their defenses provided a reality check that this loss was different, that their usual psychological protections weren't working, that they couldn't rationalize or minimize their way out of the devastation your permanent withdrawal created. The reality that their defenses failed meant they were experiencing the full, undefended weight of the loss in ways they'd successfully avoided experiencing in previous relationship endings. how the withdrawal symptoms are destroying their daily functioning and stability. The avoidant person is experiencing specific withdrawal symptoms from your permanent absence that are disrupting their daily functioning and stability in observable ways. Understanding these specific symptoms reveals the depth of their dependence on you and the severity of the impact your permanent withdrawal is creating. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as obsessive, intrusive thoughts about you that interrupt their ability to focus on work or daily tasks. The avoidant finds they cannot stop thinking about you. Thoughts of you interrupt whatever they're trying to focus on. Memories of you intrude during work tasks. Wondering about what you're doing or whether you think about them consumes mental energy they need for other activities. This obsessive thinking is a withdrawal symptom because it's their mind trying to restore a connection that's been severed, trying to maintain psychological proximity to you through constant thinking when physical and communicative proximity is no longer possible. The intrusiveness and uncontrollability of these thoughts disrupts their ability to be present in their work, their social interactions, their daily activities, making them noticeably less effective and less engaged than they were before your permanent withdrawal. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as severe anxiety that creates physical symptoms they cannot ignore or rationalize away. The avoidant is experiencing anxiety about your absence, about the permanence of the loss, about what you're thinking or doing, about whether they'll ever have contact with you again. But this isn't just emotional anxiety. It's creating physical symptoms: elevated heart rate, difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite, tension in their body, difficulty breathing normally. These physical manifestations of anxiety are withdrawal symptoms similar to what happens when someone withdraws from an addictive substance. Their nervous system is in distress from the loss of what it had become accustomed to having. The physical nature of these symptoms makes them impossible to ignore and makes their suffering visible to others who notice they seem unwell or stressed. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as depression and anhedonia, where they cannot enjoy anything or find meaning in activities that previously provided satisfaction. The avoidant discovers that nothing brings pleasure. Activities they used to enjoy feel empty. Accomplishments feel meaningless. Social interactions feel hollow. This anhedonia is a withdrawal symptom because you were a source of meaning and pleasure they didn't acknowledge. Your presence made things meaningful by having someone to share with. Your witness to their life gave activities purpose. Your care provided an underlying sense of mattering that made engagement with life worthwhile. Without you, the meaning-making structure has collapsed, leaving them depressed and unable to access pleasure or purpose. This depression disrupts their daily functioning by removing motivation to engage with life, making them withdraw from activities and relationships, creating a visible diminishment in their engagement and vitality. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as desperate attempts to get information about you through any available channel, revealing their loss of control and dignity. The avoidant, who maintained an appearance of control and independence, is now desperately seeking any information about you, checking your social media compulsively, asking mutual friends about you, finding excuses to be places where they might see you or hear about you. This desperate information seeking is a withdrawal symptom because they're trying to maintain some form of connection through information when direct connection is no longer available, trying to know about you when they cannot know you directly. This behavior reveals a loss of their typical control and dignity, makes visible their dependence and their desperation in ways that contradict their self-image and that others can observe as evidence of how affected they are. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as emotional volatility, where they cycle between numbness and intense feeling without their usual emotional regulation. The avoidant, who typically maintains emotional control, is experiencing volatility, moments of complete numbness where they feel nothing, followed by surges of intense emotion that might be grief or anger or longing. This volatility is a withdrawal symptom because their emotional regulation system depended on your presence in ways they didn't recognize. You provided a stabilizing force. Your presence helped regulate their emotional states. Your availability created a sense of security that allowed them to maintain control. Without you, their regulation system is compromised, leaving them vulnerable to emotional swings they cannot control and that disrupt their functioning and their ability to maintain their typical composed appearance. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as social withdrawal and isolation, as they cannot tolerate being around others who might notice their deteriorated state or who might mention you. The avoidant is withdrawing from social situations, canceling plans, avoiding people, partly because they cannot be present and functional in social interactions given their suffering, partly because they cannot tolerate questions about how they're doing or mentions of you that might occur in social contexts. This social withdrawal is a symptom of their withdrawal from you because your loss has destabilized them so completely that they cannot maintain social functioning, cannot be vulnerable in social contexts where their suffering might be visible, cannot risk encountering information about you through mutual friends. This isolation compounds their suffering by removing social support and making them even more alone with their obsessive thoughts about you. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as desperate bargaining or planning where they obsess over scenarios where they could restore connection or convince you to return. The avoidant spends significant mental energy generating plans to restore connection, imagining what they'd say if they could talk to you, composing messages they might send, planning encounters where they'd explain themselves or apologize, fantasizing about scenarios where you'd reconsider. This obsessive planning is a withdrawal symptom because it's their mind refusing to accept the permanence of the loss, continuing to seek pathways to restore what's been lost. The time and energy consumed by these fantasies and plans disrupts their ability to move forward or to engage with present reality, keeps them stuck in a mental space where they're trying to undo the permanent loss rather than accepting it. The withdrawal symptoms manifest as recognition that their usual defensive strategies don't work for this loss, leaving them without coping mechanisms they've relied on their entire adult life. The avoidant typically copes with discomfort through specific defenses, minimizing, rationalizing, distracting, moving on quickly. But these defenses aren't working with your permanent withdrawal. They cannot minimize its impact when they're suffering so intensely. They cannot rationalize the loss in ways that provide comfort. They cannot distract themselves because thoughts of you intrude constantly. They cannot move on when everyone is compared to you unfavorably. This failure of their usual coping mechanisms is a profound withdrawal symptom because it leaves them without the psychological tools they've relied on, leaves them exposed to the full weight of the loss without defenses that usually protect them, creates a crisis where they're suffering without the ability to employ their usual strategies to manage the suffering. What they're suffering from your permanent withdrawal means for your healing. The avoidant person's intense withdrawal symptoms and suffering from your permanent absence has specific implications for your understanding of the relationship, your healing process, and your path forward. Understanding what their suffering means helps you interpret it accurately while maintaining boundaries that serve your well-being. Their suffering means your decision to make your withdrawal permanent was the right decision, validated by evidence of the impact it's created. You might have questioned whether permanent withdrawal was the right choice, whether you should have given one more chance, whether you were being too harsh or too final. But their suffering in response to your permanent absence validates your decision. If the relationship and your presence in their life weren't important, if your withdrawal didn't matter, they wouldn't be suffering like this. Their withdrawal symptoms prove the relationship mattered profoundly to them, even though their behavior didn't communicate this while you were available. This validation supports your healing by confirming you were important, you mattered, and making your boundary permanent was a powerful, appropriate choice rather than being too harsh or punishing.